Hello, everybody. Welcome to Millionaires Are Made, where we believe that you can be a millionaire in all aspects of life. The six aspects, in fact: intellectual health, social health, physical health, mental health, spiritual health, and financial health. Today, we're talking about intellectual health. So, we really believe in the spirit of authenticity, though. It's real bias, no persuasion. I didn't even meet these guys until 15 minutes before the show. So please add any comments and questions that you guys got. All right. Y'all ready to meet our guest? Well, our first guest, Samir, tell us who you are.
Hey, Josh, it's great to be on the show again. I did it with Austin a couple months ago and it was a lot of fun. So, listen, my name is Samir Dasani and I'm a health and nutrition coach based here in South Africa. I grew up in the States, grew up in Washington, D.C. As we were just talking about, I did a bit of touring around the US with bands and so on. But I've been living here in South Africa for about 10 years now, 9 or 10 years. So, what happened was I was working in sort of corporate NGO life and I got sick. A lot of people working in corporate, we do lose our health. We prioritize the runaround over the health a lot of times. And at the same time, I was going through the company I was working for was going through the usual processes of layoffs and so on. And it was my turn. I had to lay off my staff and then lay off myself. And I thought, what could I do? I started a PhD at that time, just in part to stay here in South Africa, and in part because I had a really good advisor. And what I did when I got the PhD, I didn't go to the library I was meant to go to. So I got admission to a university. Stellenbosch University was what I was admitted to. It's like the Harvard of South Africa. It's sort of one of our top universities. And I went to the medical library and I started reading, and I got very, very angry very, very quickly, Josh, because um, basically everything I'd ever been told about health was demonstrably false. And I did all these, and it's not that it was new research. Some of what I was looking at was very new research, but a lot of it was old stuff, like 100 years old. And a lot of things that I just took for granted, like vegetables are healthy, for example. Like there's no evidence to back up that statement, zero, right? And so I took what I learned from my research, and I applied it in my own life, and I became healthy. I became probably in the best health of my life within about 6 weeks. And then again, I got really frustrated because it's like, man, I've been struggling with these issues for years, um, maybe decades. And if I was able to fix myself in 6 weeks, and then I saw people around me really were sick and needed help as well. So that's when I trained to do, in addition to my PhD, which is in anthropology, I trained to do a sort of health coaching and sort of nutrition coaching, trained from this place in Britain as well. And now I have a lot of clients who are getting themselves back together, right? Getting over long-term chronic illnesses, and also improving their mental health and their intellectual health, right? So how do we do that? I mean, I think the step one is, um, if we look at what's wrong, if we look at why we can't focus, if we look at why there's an epidemic of ADHD and similar, um, you know, problems, what's going on is a lot of it is to do with our food. I wouldn't say 100% of it is to do with our food, but a lot of it is to do with our food, right? So you have these spikes, these sugar spikes that everyone's going on throughout the day. I grew up in the 80s and 90s when we were told you have to eat 4 or 5 times a day. You got to eat these small meals, carb heavy meals. And that's really, really terrible advice. We now know, like it will destroy your concentration, among other things. So the first thing we do is we change how people approach food, right? So we say, look, can we actually eat bigger meals fewer times a day so that we're not doing this insulin spike thing and this which is really distracting, which doesn't let us focus. Can we do fewer meals? Can you experiment with fasting? If you have weight to lose, some people don't have weight to lose, in which case we're kind of nervous to do fasting, especially if someone is underweight. Fasting is a tool that we use a lot of the time. And if I'm talking with, for example, I have some clients who are CEOs who are self-made millionaires, and often what they find is if they have a deadline, if they have a project, if they have something they really have to work on, they will fast that day. Even I myself, so during this PhD sort of journey that I've been on, there have been times when I've had to teach classes, and teaching classes to like 30 undergraduates is not easy, especially at the kind of It's kind of long lectures that I'm giving, 3-hour classes.
Mm.
So what I would do, and so 4 to 7 in the afternoon, this was like adult students. So they would go to work all day, and then towards the end of the day, they'd come over to the university, and I'd teach a class. So you can imagine trying to keep their interest from like 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. is really tough. And what I would do in order to give the best lecture I could, in order to be the most responsive I could, I would actually fast that day. I wouldn't eat at all, right? And maybe I'd eat when I got back home after 8:30 or 9. Maybe I'd have a dinner, but I wouldn't have eaten since the morning. And I found when I learned that trick, I was just so much sharper. So fasting is a really cool tool to use. I also use just really low carb, sort of ketogenic diets as another way to do it, another way to sort of sharpen mental health in general. There's a great book out called Brain Energy by Dr. Chris Palmer, who's a Harvard trained, and I think he teaches at Harvard too, psychiatrist. And he shares in that book, he shares the science, but he also shares several case studies about people with very serious mental illness, schizophrenia, and so on, and people with not so serious mental illness, your typical sort of ADHD children and so on, who've really been able to find a lot of benefits just by cutting out the carbs. So those are really, two of the sort of basic approaches that we use. In some of the more difficult cases, or people, as I say, I work with sort of high performing CEOs, especially. And in those cases, like, if people are really sort of, what I find with the CEOs is that they tend to be type A personalities. They really want to have everything sort of in the spreadsheet, and they want to have their routine pinned down. So in those cases, and if someone's already got their diet, really, really spot on, we'll go to things like exercise. What's the best exercise for this individual to really help them focus and sort of improve concentration if that's their goal, or be able to perform at a high level. So exercise is important. Meditation can be important. We talk about gratitude meditation as a really interesting one, to really sort of focus people and sort of get them motivated. And then many other things that I'm sure we'll get into in the conversation. But for me, getting rid of the carbs and just considering doing some fasting, if you're open to that, those are sort of two of the tricks that we can definitely use. They've certainly improved my life a whole lot.
So your tip, it sounds like, is fasting for sure. But what would you say that people can replace those carbs with, right? Like, when you take something away, you got to really put something back.
Yeah, for sure.
What would you say they could, besides a pasta or a bread or whatever, put into their diet that would help benefit their diet?
I mean, the problem with that question is sometimes it's really culturally mediated, right? And sometimes, there's another thing that I won't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, for example, I'm not a huge fan of like cauliflower, for example. But if someone is coming from an Asian culture, I come from an Asian culture. My family eats a lot of rice, and if we could use, riced cauliflower, which you just put in the food processor for a minute, and it sort of turns into sort of something with a rice-like consistency. If we can use that to help someone transition to a meal that's more focused around fats, especially animal fats. So to answer your question, what do you replace carbs with? You have to replace it with fats. There's
Mm.
a certain maximum we can actually eat in terms of protein. No one really knows what it is, and certainly it varies from person to person. But between, say, 30 and 45% of calories at most can come from protein. So the remaining 55 to 70% have to come from some combination of carbohydrates and fat. And if you're reducing the carbohydrates, you have to, almost by definition, you have to increase the fats.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've been doing things like this week. I'm doing something. I haven't made this video yet, but it's a video that I'll be making. I'm producing it, where I'm eating basically like 500 grams. I think it wasn't 500. I didn't make it that far. I think yesterday was 250 grams of butter, which is an insane. I think it's like 1,500 calories worth of butter. I'm doing that, and I'm doing that every day just to prove that I can lose weight while being in a calorie excess. Make
Yeah,
sense?
I do. And I asked that question specifically because I personally recently went on a carnivore diet, and I've had some skin problems throughout my life, and it cleared them like almost immediately. Well, I say almost immediately, about 6 weeks, like you said with your stuff, um, fasting away from vegetables of all things. So, and I
Yeah,
thought I was going
100%.
to feel like really crappy, and like moving into it, I'm like, oh, I'm going to lose all this energy. I'm going to be craving, rice and pasta and all these things. And I found it was actually quite the opposite. that
Yeah.
making my lifestyle accommodate to that actually added to my lifestyle, and even our local restaurants and stuff that I frequent like began to make dishes and stuff for me that would accommodate. So
Yeah,
um
100%. Remember, my background is in anthropology, and I'm sort of a historian and a researcher. Yeah.
yeah.
And so if you go back to the origins of like diet culture, what was the first sort of popular diet? Was something called the Banting diet in the 19th century, about 1850s, right?
Mm.
This Banting, Mr. Banting was a big guy. And the only way he tried many diets, and he wrote about all of his experiences and so on. The only diet that really worked was what he called did he call it the animal-based diet, the meat-based diet, which was basically, now he was a gentleman of luxury in the 19th century. He couldn't do without his wine and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So it was basically meat and wine. That was his whole diet, right? And he lost it's a lot of weight. We're talking about 150 pounds, which in those days was like unheard of. Nowadays, we do find cases like this just because obesity is so rampant in our societies. So that's what I meant when I said, we have evidence for what actually helps with both physical and mental health going back a lot longer than that, right? So even before humans were there, there's a species called Homo erectus. Whenever you find Homo erectus, so this is something that existed contemporary with we're Homo sapiens, they're Homo erectus. They existed contemporary with us, but also before us. They're one of the longest lived species of Homo, of our relatives, right? And whenever you find their bones in the archaeological record, you always find the bones of big elephants because that's what they were eating: mastodons, mammoths, and so on.
Yeah.
So, and I don't, and remember, most of the period that we're talking about with Homo erectus was an ice age. So there wasn't any salads, there wasn't any broccoli, I guarantee you, right?
Yeah.
Most of what we're eating, in fact, maybe they were using some plants as medicines. It's hard to tell. But in terms of calories, almost all of the calories was coming from, and you can imagine when you kill an elephant, how much food is that? That's a huge amount of food.
A lot amount of food. Yeah. Yeah.
You feed a lot of people for a lot of time. So these kind of it's not an anecdote. This is no one disagrees with it. No one in paleoanthropology, archaeology would disagree that Homo erectus, co-evolved and lived very closely with elephants, right? And so it's from that it just follows. Or same with early Homo sapiens. Like when we look at the actual bone records, we find that there's a way you can now, with modern technology, you can do what's called a nitrogen isotope analysis.
Mm.
So because nitrogen has to, anyone who's done any farming will know that you have to sort of fix nitrogen in the soil. It doesn't come naturally in the air. You got to sort of get it in the soil every time, right? It's not already there. So what that means is the nitrogen is going from the soil to the plants, from the plants to the animals, and from the animals to whatever eats that animal, right? So from one animal to the next. So in other words, you can tell where on the food chain a given animal was. And so we can look at human bones and compare them with the bones of, say, ancient tigers or ancient foxes or ancient bears or ancient cows and say how much plant to animal food were these early humans eating. And we find that they were eating more than 70% of their food from animal sources, sometimes more than 90% of their food, but at least more than 70% of their food from animal sources. That is a technical category, right? So if an animal in the fossil record eats more than 70% of its food from animal sources, it is what's known as a hypercarnivore, right? Hypercarnivores, so it's eating more than the omnivorous animals like bears and foxes and so on. It's eating as much meat as lions and tigers and so on. So once we understand that about human physiology, then your anecdote, so you say, okay, I ate only meat for a certain period of time and all my health issues cleared, then we can sort of say, well, that makes a lot of sense because you started eating an evolutionary appropriate diet for your species. And just like when you go to the zoo, it says, don't feed the animals popcorn. When you feed us popcorn, it's not great for us either, right?
Yeah.
So when you take all that stuff out, then you're suddenly seeing great improvements. And it's not just in the physical stuff. It's also in our brain health. It's also our mental health, our intellectual health.
Well, let's jump back in that. I want to bring one of our next guests on, Zachariah, and we'll all gather and discuss that again. That's a great tip, Samir. So thank you for your input there. Zachariah, how are you today?
Wonderful, my friend. It's good to see you, Josh. How you doing?
Good, good. So tell our audience here, who are you, Zachariah?
I, as you see before you, am Zachariah Frank. I also go by Zach the Health King in my personal branding. I am the CMO of the Center for Advancement in Cancer Education, also known as becancer.org, and I'm also a podcast host. My podcast is called The Health King's Court, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Health. So those are the two kind of things that I'm up to primarily. But how did I get here? Well, Like most people, really anyone that has a brain and a soul when they're born, I, as a young person, comprehended that, like Samir was alluding to, everything that we're taught and fed and that's pushed and purported upon us is just garbage. It's just wrong. It's just false. It's just lies. And the education system kind of failed at getting rid of that intuition in me. They kind of failed at stamping out that inquisitive spirit and that inquisitive nature and that desire to rebel against the garbage. And as a young man, I didn't quite know what to make of the world, but like I said, just knew it wasn't right, like everyone does. But what do? You get on with it, right? So I did the whole university thing. I went to university to be a psychologist. I was going to be a clinical therapist, counselor, psychologist, whatever you want to call it. I really wanted to help people get their own minds right because just observing everyone, I realized that people weren't right internally, starting from their minds. And so, of course, they were going to be in perpetuity suffering throughout their existence and throughout their lifetime. Unfortunately, or perhaps very fortunately, as I was going through university, I established that I very much disagreed with the establishment of mental health and the establishment of psychology and the establishment of how I would be able to operate in that official licensure. So I decided to jump ship and drop off that path. Now here I am. What do I do? I got my degree anyway in psychology. Let's figure out what to do now. Tried a couple different jobs, ended up in finance, working for a big bank. Don't ask me how, just made it there. And you start up at the bottom of the barrel there. I was working my way up. I won't name the institution, but it was one of the absolute major banks. I was on the back end, working my way up the ladder. That didn't last very long, right? I was doing the whole commute, 9 to 5, sit in the cubicle, walk around if you're lucky at lunch. It was a miserable existence. And because the job was so easy, I spent a lot of time on the internet, on Instagram, whatever. I'll just get the work done and have spare time. And just happened to come across, I guess we'll just be straight and call it rabbit holes. And I just started diving down every single rabbit hole I could find. And it just started learning about just exactly what's going on in the world, right? Like I said, I always knew things weren't right. We all do. But then I was getting to the details of it. There's what in the water? They're putting what in the food?
Mm.
What's fractional reserve banking? Like, all this stuff. It just really started becoming clear to me, and I started really learning just how this world works and just how much and how deep the lies go and the garbage go and just how artificial what people were putting into their minds or allowing to be put into their minds was. And so I started going on a diet for my own brain, such as the title of this show here, and realized, of course, that I was part of a banking institution and just a cog in that machine that was very detrimental to humanity. Jump ship there with the plan only of I'm not doing this anymore. Since then, I have been doing different entrepreneurial ventures. I've done anything from being involved in cryptocurrency and foreign exchange trading systems and products. I've also been a trader myself. I ran a custom boat flooring business down in Puerto Rico, traveling the island for a couple years. Done a couple things, and that has all brought me to the here and now. And simultaneously, I've been on my health journey because as you dive down the rabbit holes of figuring out what's going on in the world and comprehending just how much you've been lied to about health, like Samir again so wonderfully said, in all regards, if you love yourself, which I very much do, and you value yourself, which I very much do, how can you not make drastic changes in your own life and in your own existence based in the information that you've exposed yourself to? So I've been on a radical health transformation journey for the last several years, and it's had ups and downs. It's had different kind of iterations. And again, like Samir so wonderfully shared, I also went plant-based for a good amount of time. And I kind of had a journey and experience and lived the life of a plant-based person. Now, I will always give the due credit to plant-based diets that it was incredibly detoxifying for myself. And I did experience a large period of my health increasing in different capacities, especially coming off of a more so traditional American diet, or standard American diet. But then over some time, my body just started screaming out for more. It started screaming out for something, and that something I knew in my heart was fats, but I just wasn't ready philosophically to go back to the consumption of meat. I was convinced at the time that for some reason the consumption of meat, or meat products, was evil, or I was convinced of the propaganda that it was not the way that life should be, and that it made you a bad person, whatever. That's the truth of it. And through a philosophy change, because I always stay adaptive, I always stay willing to adopt new information and willing to observe new information and do my own science of trying different things. I ended up giving my body exactly what it was looking for, started eating meat again, and then again, I've been on an up and up path since then, and now I'm primarily a meat eater. But far beyond diet, health goes into all aspects of life, right? Because during these years, I haven't just been addressing what I put in my mouth, because that's such a small fraction of what we do, but addressing what clothing I'm wearing, what water I'm drinking, what air I'm breathing, who I'm hanging around, what activities I'm partaking in. Because health is not anything that's able to be isolated, right? We can look at and form an identity around what we put in our mouths. Great. But if we want to be healthy, there's so much more to consider. So I've been on my own health journey, making improvements along the way, learning more along the way. And I just genuinely have a passion for helping other people do the same, because I've experienced, as I've detoxified not just my body, but also my brain, my mind, my spirit, my emotions, whatever you call them, I have increased my life satisfaction and fulfillment and overall experience. And so I genuinely want to help others do the same, which brings me to the here and now in my two avenues of doing so. I am the CMO of the Center for Advancement in Cancer Education, where we specifically educate people on holistic ways to prevent or heal cancer and kind of remedy people's mental construct around cancer as a whole. We truly address cancer in a mind, body, spirit connection way. And I also have my personal podcast where I talk about not just matters of physical health, but also mental, emotional, spiritual, what have you. I'm having conversations on all sorts of topics with wonderful guest experts to teach people about anything from sexual abuse trauma to biological dentistry and art therapy, and then really anything in between. So my goal is just to educate people and empower people to be able to live more fulfilled, healthy existences.
Cool. Cool. Well, thank you for that, Zachariah. And we'll get everybody on here to chat about that tip here a little bit later. I want to bring on our final guest real quick, Davidson.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Yeah, nice.
How
I'm
are you
excited to be
today?
here. Doing pretty well. How about you?
Good, good. Well, so tell us who you are and what your tip is that you want to bring the audience on improving their intellectual health.
Yeah, I love what everyone is saying. Zachariah and Samir. It's interesting, right? When you're in this world, like you realize like how holistic and how integrated everything is. Um, Yeah, so I similar to Zachariah, I've done the corporate thing and moved up the corporate ladder, and I thought like making more money would make me happy, right? It's like, oh, like I'm moving up, have all like a brand new car, a brand new house, like all these different things. I'm like, oh yeah, I should be happier because on paper, publishing all these books, 500,000 subscribers, like becoming a LinkedIn influencer. I'm like, but why do I still feel like empty inside? Like, why do I feel like, no matter how much success, winning all the awards at LinkedIn, Employee of the Month, etc. Like I'm like, oh, and then I had a huge breakthrough during the pandemic. I was like, oh, because everything was extrinsic motivated. Like it was all like what other people wanted me to do, what my boss wanted me to do. It's like, hey, if you get promoted, and it was a classic carrot and the sticks. So I went on this like lifelong journey, did all the Tony Robbins, in Fiji for, spent $150,000 hiring like a bunch of different coaches, joined all these different programs, and was really, and it's funny because what I learned from that whole process, it's like, like there's actually nothing wrong with me. Like I'm whole and complete. And it was all around like self-love and just like, but I like what Zachariah is saying about like being very mindful of who you're spending time with, right? Because we are the average of 5 people that we spend the most time with. So I started auditing like where I spent my time. It's like, am I posting on social media just to get more likes, to get more followers? Like, or is there actually like a purpose behind what I'm trying to do? So I went on this year. I went on like a 16-day solo road trip, like that I was putting off for a while. And I just posted on social media without any plan, really. I was just like, I'm just going to do it. And then a lot of people reached out to me. They're like, oh, you can crash at my place. And just kind of went on this like soul searching journey. So this year, I went up to like 1,000 random strangers, like in New York City and all these different places, and just started asking them like deep questions about their lives. Like, do you have any regrets? Like, what is the saddest, what's the happiest moment that happened to you? And yeah, I would say my advice is, because a lot of my friends have passed away, unfortunately, from like drugs and mental health and things like that. It's like, don't be afraid to just like do the thing that you've been putting off. Like whatever you're most afraid of, like just go ahead and do it. So that's what I've been up to this year, and it's been a journey. It's been fun, but I created a mastermind around similar minded folks who are always seeking, who are, people that are trying all these biohacking things, and just having a space for us to just share. And I have guest speakers that are coming in that are like mentors that I have met in life that I deem like experts, or people that are really really good at like all these different facets of life. So that's what I've been creating lately.
Cool. Awesome, man. Well, I want to bring everybody on here to have a conversation about our tips and kind of share for the audience here. You guys have all had really, really great tips here. So what it seems we've kind of got even a prevailing theme of separate from what is traditionally taught or the education system is putting on us. So what do you guys think about Samir's tip in particular?
What was my tip, Josh? I was the fasting.
Let's get to
The fasting, man, like that the fasting that you brought in your anthropology history, I think is really pertinent to what we're talking about here.
Got it. I think fasting is so grossly underutilized while simultaneously being overly glamorized and glorified. I think fasting is looked at by some people as a cure-all, and unfortunately, it's not that. And I think when gone about in an incorrect way, can bring about more problems than it solves. But on the flip side, I think a proper fast, whether that is a water fast, a broth fast, or a different kind of fast, juice fast, done in the right implementation, can give the body and its organs and its digestive system the break it needs to turn inwards and heal and kind of work on things that it needs to work on, rather than trying to work to digest more food that's continually thrown at it. So I think it's a super powerful tool, but with any power comes responsibility to use it well.
Yeah, I think do your own research, right? Every human being is different, and you kind of have to try what works for you, right? What works for Samir might not work for Zachariah, might not work for Joshua, right? So I'm a proponent of like trying all these different things. Like, hey, how do you respond to low carb diet? How do you respond to a carnivore diet, right? Everyone's different. So I have just journaled on like, okay, how do I feel when I'm doing above a certain amount of protein or above a certain amount of carbs? And it's, and if I do healthy fats, like if I incorporate more omega-3s, like how do I feel after that, right? So just being cognizant and just being aware of like, okay, like pasta takes me out like for a whole day. It's like, okay, maybe don't mess with pasta, right? So I do think like just being curious and just being conscious of like, okay, if this has a billion things on the label, like I probably shouldn't be eating this, because that means it's just not natural, right? Versus like
kind of taking an inventory, huh?
Yeah.
Well, and Zachariah, you had some good points here, and I'm particularly curious to hear about your beet cancer venture there. What do you think led you there as far as a diet that you could implement?
What led me to working with Beat Cancer as far as a diet? Is that the question?
Or what? Let me rephrase it a little bit. What do you teach in that as far as diet goes?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'll be as brief as possible. Our founder, Susan Silberstein, she and her research and her education back 50 years ago were heavily plant based in healing. Now, I will always give the caveat that when we are addressing a specific issue, when we're addressing a specific ailment or illness, and are recommending a diet for that, that doesn't necessarily mean that's an overall, this is what you have to do always in all circumstances diet. So traditionally, and a large amount of our educational materials do emphasize plant-based healing for cancer specifically. But right now, we are seeing a prevalence and an emergence of wonderful both cultural shifts and scientific shifts advocating for more ancestral or carnivore or meat based diets. And the wonderful thing about Beat Cancer is that it's not a dogmatic, this is the end all be all solution, this is the formula, everyone follows this. No. We have a community of so many different minds, of so many different backgrounds, of so many different thoughts and opinions. And because we have not just our one in house naturopathic doctor that we offer counseling with, but we've also trained and certified hundreds of holistic cancer coaches, there's something for everybody. If you want to explore a plant based diet, we have coaches that'll help you do that. If you want to be more carnivore, a more ancestral diet, and that feels right to you, we have coaches that'll help you do that. So I think both of them can be valid. So to address diet specifically, I think it depends on your ancestral background yourself. I think it depends on your state of health currently yourself. There's so many demographic variables that can bring you to figure out what might be optimal now. And ultimately what it comes down to, which is my overall tip for anyone, I realize I didn't give one at the beginning, is be your own scientist. Stop outsourcing science and thinking and conclusions and testing and all these things. We are supposed to be our own scientists, figuring things out, observing information, and conducting experiments on our own health, because that N of one sample size of you is the only thing that really matters to you.
Man, that's great. That's great stuff. And, for our audience here, we've got YouTube links and all social links here shared for everybody. So check them out and check out these tips that we've got for you guys here today. I just want to thank you guys for being on and sharing some of your wisdom. We really believe that every person you meet has something that can, you can learn and engage with them on, and you guys have shared some really, really valuable information. So I also want to give a big shout out to some of our followers here on Facebook, Spencer Jones and Edward White, and on Instagram, Saba Fiona. So we really appreciate you guys participating in our program and joining us here at Millionaires Are Made. So again, thank you guys so much for joining us, Davidson, Zachariah, Samir. You guys have a fantastic day. And